Welcome back to my channel for another short Leica episode. And in a recent video about shooting the night sky with the Leica M10R and the Tri-Elmar-M 16, 18, 21, I asked the question if people would actually care about a fully fledged review of that very special Leica-M lens. And the resonance was very positive. Quite some people said, yes, go for it, do it. And that's what I'm going to deliver in this video. Let's kick this off. For me, the Leica Tri-Elmar-M 16, 18, 21 is a lens I use mainly for landscape. For architecture, I typically go for shift lenses because that helps me to get perspective correction right. But people, of course, who purchase this lens, they also want to know, is this lens also suitable for wide-angle architectural shots? And that's what we are going to explore in this video. What I can say is that I have quite some experience with this lens. So here it's currently mounted on my Leica M11. But I did shoot it, as in that video I mentioned before, on the Leica M10R, and I also did shoot it on the Leica M10 Mono, and you find that image in another video. I will link all them down below in the info box, so you can look them up if you have interest. Thinking about the Tri-Elmar, the first question is it a zoom lens, or is it a lens which has implemented three different focal lengths, namely 16mm, 18mm, and 21mm? And I said in my last video where I used this lens, it's not a zoom lens, it's a three focal length lens. But some people in the comments rightly so pointed out that it works like a zoom lens. And let's have a look here quickly. So if I turn the camera on and get here the lens cap off. So let's get this in the center here of my video camera. And if I start now to turn this ring here from, so this one here, from 16 to 18mm, watch what happens with the live view here. It zooms in. Now it locks in at 18mm, and if I further turn it, it zooms again and locks in at 21mm. Now what happens between these fixed stops or locks for 16, 18 and 21mm, I think we can hardly call a zoom, but there is a zoom effect which you see if you pay attention to what's happening if I turn that ring here. It's actually almost zooming. So I would probably call this lens a hybrid. I don't think it is a zoom lens, and Leica also doesn't sell it and describe it as a zoom lens. They describe it as a lens with three different focal lengths, 16, 18, 21mm, but what we see in the live view looks a little bit like a zoom, which is quite interesting. So going up from 18 to 21mm, have a look again, it actually zooms. And that is something which you can of course exploit, so you can interpolate between 16 and 18mm if you want. The shot will be taken, there is nothing wrong with it, but the original purpose was to have three different wide angle settings here, 16, 18 and 21mm. A second point I want to make on the Tri-Elmar is that some people pointed out in the comments, but also you find it in the web in different places, that this lens has quite some distortion on the boundaries of the lens. And that is something you typically don't want to have in architecture. And I will show later a sample image which I took to illustrate what I'm talking about, where you actually see bended lines, so distortion, which are almost impossible to correct in Lightroom. I will nevertheless show how to correct them and to get the best out of the image. And I will mention in the course of the video a few things which I think will make Leica M shooters loving this lens, and I actually love this lens. I use it a lot for wide angle photography, and you need to understand this lens in order to appreciate it. And that's actually what this video is about, because if you look at the surface, it's very easy to criticize this lens and find all kinds of things which are not good enough, including the distortions. But if you understand it, first of all, how to shoot it, if you understand the specifications, if you understand how to correct distortions in post-processing, you will start to appreciate that lens, and once in a while you will love that lens. And I promise that at the end of the video, I hopefully will have convinced you that this is a really valuable lens in the Leica M lens lineup. Let's talk about some of the specifications of the lens. So first of all, what is the field of view we get here? If we shoot at 16mm, we actually have on the diagonal 107 degrees angle, and that is really, really wide. Of course, we can call this ultra wide. At 18mm, it comes down from 107 degrees to 100 degrees, and at 21mm, you have 92 degrees, so still quite wide. And that is all calculated for a full frame sensor like we have it in the Leica M10R or here in the Leica M11 or the M10 Mono. Let's talk about minimum focusing distance of that lens. So I'm here at the 16mm focal length setting, and if I now turn here the focus ring, I can go down all the way to 0.5 meter. Then it has a hard stop. That's end of story. And you see there is a different coloring here on the engravings. So from 0.5 meter up to just 0.7 meter, everything is gray. And then from 0.7 meter on, it is white engraved. And that is something like I indicated. So this is kind of the closest distance you get. And this doesn't change if you change the focal length. So at 18 millimeters, still a hard stop here. At 21 millimeter, still a hard stop. This lens is not a lens you can use for macro photography or close-up shots because the maximum reproduction ratio at 16 millimeter is 1 divided by 38, so pretty small. At 18 millimeter, it becomes a bit better from 1 divided by 38 to 1 divided by 35, but that doesn't move the needle, and it ends up at 1 divided by 30 at 21 millimeter. So not really a lens you would consider for macro photography or close-up shots. On the aperture ring, the widest open aperture you can choose here is an f4. Then you can stop this down all the way to f22. And the aperture ring also has the usual half stops. So this is f4. This is between f4 and f5.6. Then f5.6. Here is another lock, is another half stop. Then it stops down to f8 and so on. The build quality of the lens is absolutely superb. It has the usual Leica-M lens quality. And in general, it's a very nice lens. Also from the finish, it actually matches my Leica M11 here quite nicely with that black matte finish. The lens is not heavy like many other M lenses, so the weight of the lens is 335 gram. And the length of the lens is actually, if you look at that here, is 62 millimeter, and the lens hood consumes another 10 millimeter. So if we add this up, we have 62 for the lens. 10 millimeter for the lens hood ends up at, in this construction here, 72 millimeter. When we spoke about gray and white distance scale on the lens, I promised to come back on this. And I will start with the depth of field table, and there is a depth of field table for each of these focal lengths. So we have one for 16 millimeter, one for 18 and one for 21 millimeter. And typically in these tables, you start by choosing an aperture. And let's say we go for an aperture of f5.6, and then you choose your focusing distance. Let's say we go for 1 meter, and then we find our depth of field, which is the range where we can safely say that in this range everything is reasonably sharp. So here it is from 0.64 meter to 2.7 meter. And that's the way these tables work. Let's stay with this example. So we are here at 16 millimeter focal length and f5.6. We focus at 1 meter and we get a focus range between 0.64 and 2.7 meter. Now, how can we identify this range? Of course, not as detailed as on the depth of field table on the lens. Let's have a quick look here. So here's the lens, and we start by choosing the focal length, which here has 3 options, but we go for 16 millimeter. We have an aperture selected, f5.6, and we have a focusing distance selected. And now we have also at the mount side of the lens, this aperture repeating itself. It's not only at the aperture ring, but it's also at the mount side of the lens. What we also see here at the bottom, or let's call it the mount side of the lens, are these jagged lines going from an aperture value here up to the distance scale. And there is a deeper meaning to it. And if we go here to the left-hand side, we see the 3 focal lengths. So 21, 18, 16. The 16 you can hardly read from here. And the way this works with these jagged lines here is in the following. If we go for 21 millimeter, currently we are on 16, but assume for a moment we were at 21 millimeter, then the upper line segment is the one which is relevant and connects the aperture value at the bottom or the mount side of the lens with the distance scale. I come to the meaning in a moment. If we are at 18 millimeter, it's the second line segment here, and if we are at 16 millimeter, it's the third line segment. So the way to think about these jagged lines is not to follow them, but is to really use the vertical segments of it to connect the aperture value with the distance scale. So we are at 16 millimeter, which is referring to these line segments here on this jagged line here, going from f5.6 to the distance scale. So we have to extend this in a vertical way and in the same way on the right hand side. So let's do this. And then we end up at 2 values here. And if we look at them, The left-hand side value is just between 0.6 and 0.7 meter, but much closer to 0.6, and that corresponds to the exact value we just did read off the DOF table here, 0.64 meter. The same story goes on the right-hand side. We have here the aperture f5.6, which corresponds to the one we've chosen. We have that jagged line here going up to the distance scale. And now we have to pay attention to this segment here, vertically extended to the distance scale and end up at a value between 2 and 3. More far away from the 2, closer to the 3, and that corresponds in a rough way to the 2.682 meter we again did read off here from the DOF table. Let's do another quick example, this time with a different focal length. Let's take this at 21 millimeter. Let's fix an aperture of f8 and a focusing distance of 2 meter. And then we find here that everything between close to a meter and infinity should be reasonably sharp. That's the way we can read this depth of field table. Now, if we want to identify this on the lens, first of all, we choose the 21 millimeter setting. Then we choose an aperture of f8 and a focusing distance of 2 meter. And then we find the aperture f8 also at the lens mount side here. So at the bottom of the lens, you could say. And then if we follow now these jagged lines here, we have now to choose the most upper segment, because here's the 21 millimeter. So if we do that, we end up at a value just close before 1, which is corresponding to the 0.9. And we end on the right-hand side at somewhere on the right-hand side of infinity, which means this is sharp up to infinity. And that's confirming what we read off the depth of field table. Let me conclude this little excursion with a couple of remarks which I also think are interesting to know. First of all, I talked before about the white scale starting with 0.7 and the gray scale. And the reason why Leica distinguishes this is because from 0.7 meter up to infinity, you can actually use the rangefinder for focusing. That doesn't work if you go closer than 0.7 meter, and that's why the scale here is gray and not white to indicate that. The second point I wanted to make on that slide is that at 0.7 there is a soft lock. So if you turn the focus ring, it kind of locks in, but you can easily move it then in one or the other direction back if you want, but it locks in at 0.7 meter. So if you have the rangefinder on your eye and you focus, it will give you some look and feel that you're reaching that point, 0.7 meter, where beyond that, if you go closer, you can no longer focus with the rangefinder, but then you have to go, of course, with the LCD or the electronic viewfinder. That works, and the range where this works in particular is 0.5 to 0.7 meter, but clearly also beyond 0.7 meter. So if you want to have the full distance scale from 0.5 to infinity, the LCD or EVF is your best friend. From 0.7 to infinity, the rangefinder will do a great job. Another point I wanted to quickly make is the following. Let's say we focus at the minimum focusing distance of 0.5 meter. I showed before that there is a hard stop here. And then we still have extended this gray colored scale to the left-hand side of the minimum focusing distance. And the reason why you need this is if you want to measure your depth of field on the lens, you just need the scale to extend to the left-hand side, even of the minimum focusing distance. So for instance, if we shoot at an f11, we have this jagged line here. And if we shoot at 21 millimeter, this is the relevant one. And you see here your depth of field or your range, where everything within this range is reasonably sharp, starts already before 0.4 meter. And that is why you need that scale. And if we go to the extreme on the side, turn the lens a little bit, we see the scale goes even down to 30 centimeter. And if we shoot most stop down at f22, we have, for instance, for 18 millimeter here, an indication that the depth of field starts already before 0.3 meters, so really close to your lens and to your camera. And if you would shoot at 21 millimeter, it would still start at, let's say, 0.33 here. So there is a lot of information you see when you take time, stare at the lens, understand the mechanism and the process to determine your depth of field. It's never as accurate as if you read it off the depth of field table, but your depth of field table might not always be with you and the lens is on the camera and you're shooting with it. So I think that is something interesting to know and helps to clearly understand that quite complex Tri-Elmar lens. Let's now turn what we just saw in the depth of field tables into practical applications. And a consequence of what we saw in that DOF tables is that you can shoot this lens almost all the time focusing at infinity like here. You actually don't have to focus. this lens is almost leading to a point and shoot situation. And the reason is, if you want to have the sweet spot of the lens, I recommend shooting at f5.6, and we just saw the data in the DOF tables what it means. If you want to be on the safe side and you have a bright day, you can shoot it at f8 or f11, but then latest you don't have to focus. Just keep it all the time at infinity, and if you use this for wide angle street photography, you can just always shoot. There is no delay by focusing, because everything in the image will be crisp and sharp. And even at an f4, which I used for some of the images I'm going to show in a moment, you will see that the scene in front of the camera is in its representation in the image super sharp, super crisp, and I didn't focus at all. I always had it at infinity, and that is one of the things I think people should appreciate, and you can laugh about that lens, which is not unusual for an ultra wide angle lens, but is something which makes your workflow when you take photos very quick. You can fully focus on your image composition. You don't have to care at all about focusing. Just set it at infinity and you're good to go. Let's now have a look at a few sample images. So I was shooting here with the M11 and the Tri-Elmar in an industrial part of Zurich city, and I want to point out a few things. So first of all, let's look into how the field of view is changing if you go from 16 to 18 and then to 21 millimeters. So here's an image, and this is shot at 16 millimeter, by the way, is crisp and sharp, nice, all good. And if we then go to 18 millimeter, the field of view changes like this. So from here to here. And if I go to 21 millimeter, it gets a bit more into the scene. So that's the way the field of view changes, 16, 18, 21 millimeter. Let's now turn our attention to the quote-unquote problem of the Tri-Elmar 16, 18, 21. And I mentioned it at the beginning of the video. There is a lot of criticism coming from distortions this lens has in images, which is nothing unusual for wide-angle lenses. And so far I provided a lot of arguments why we actually should love this Leica-M lens. Its build quality, its design, its low weight, its flexibility, its sharpness. We'll come to that later and we'll have a look into more sample images, but lots of things to like about that lens. But distortion, for some people, and for good reasons actually, is a killer argument to actually don't touch that lens. Let's have a look into this. Let's see how I dealt with it in my sample images. In the datasheet of the lens, Leica actually makes very transparent what distortion means for the lens. And you see here the effective distortion diagram for all three focal lengths we have built into that Tri-Elmar lens. And you see there is quite some bending going on when it comes to the boundaries of the lens. And we need to look into that now. I will show and explain everything by means of a sample image, and I will also show you how to fix that. So this is the image I want to use to illustrate what I did on distortion. And it's a nice image because if you have a super wide angle, this is the shot at 16 millimeter here, you typically have a lot of foreground here. And here the foreground is nicely filled. There are interesting things going on with these balls and this piece of art you have here. And also you see that this is a super sharp image. If I go here to 100%, even in the foreground, and I was shooting this at an f4, is super sharp, super crisp. You see a lot of detail here, a woman sitting on the bench here and doing something on the smartphone. It's a very nice image, but there is one problem. I got the line straight here by using the respective guided lines for perspective correction in Lightroom. And that looks good, that part of the image, but here on the upper right hand side corner, I was not able to correct that bending here. And that is something we saw indicated in the distortion diagrams a moment ago. And no matter what I tried, I could not get this bending out. And you see these lines here, they just don't look like they look in real life, because here is distortion kicking in on the lens. So I looked one last time, desperate of course, at my nice Lightroom image. And then I decided to switch to Capture One. In Capture One, I was more lucky because Capture One has better tools for perspective correction, and I actually was able in Capture One to completely eliminate the distortions and do these perspective corrections which make the image just a clean and better image. And by the way, both Capture One as well as Lightroom have the lens profile for the Leica Tri-Elmar, so you get already some work done before you have to become active yourself. You see here side by side the same frame, one on the left hand side developed with Capture One 22 and applying to the best of my knowledge all distortion correction I have available, and the right hand side the same process in Lightroom Classic, and here I was just not able to remove the distortions. But on the left hand side this is now almost perfect, not 100% but good enough for me to use that frame. There is not much more to say. I think I covered everything which is to say about that lens, including its main problem, namely distortion, but also showing a way how to correct it. Here's one more image I wanted to quickly show. And I was shooting this at f4 and focusing at infinity. And we see actually in the depth of field table I showed before that then the range of reasonable sharpness starts at about 3.2 meters and continues until infinity or the horizon. And you see this here. If I look here, this is a bit fuzzy, kind of okay, but the more I go into the scene from here on, it starts to be really sharp and really crisp. And I think you get a lot of details in these images. The lens actually is astonishingly enough sharp corner to corner. If you go to the corners of the lens or the boundaries of the lens, it is very sharp, as you can see here. There is absolutely no fallout of sharpness at the corners or boundaries of the lens, and I like that a lot. In general, as I said at the beginning, there are so many things to love about that lens, and that one shortcoming, which is distortion, you can correct in post. I hope you liked that short Leica episode about the Tri-Elmar 16-18-21 f4. I think this is a terrific lens. I really like it. I understand if people criticize it, but if you think about what I said, what actually should be loved about this lens and what people should appreciate, I think are strong arguments. And if you see how I was able to correct the distortions in Capture One, not in Lightroom, but in Capture One, so I got a really good image out of that lens, sharp corner to corner, then I think this lens is an ideal companion for wide-angle shooters, in particular in landscape, but also, and that's the question I raised at the beginning of the video, also for architecture. If you liked that video, don't forget to drop me a thumbs up. Stay tuned on my channel, there is always more to come. Thanks for watching, stay safe and healthy, and of course, peace out.